One of the things that as advocates we're always concerned about are underlying causes of why victimization is happening. And one of the new areas of research that is coming forward and gaining more and more credibility is something called epigenetic inheritance. And this is the idea that you can inherit an experience even though you didn't experience it yourself. So I'm not a geneticist. I'm giving you a very, very simple explanation. And the key part of this is that events that happened to ancestors, and it looks to be matrilineal, the marker that they've identified comes from the mother. You can inherit that, and it can be turned on or it can be turned off depending upon circumstances. So while you may not have experienced an event, if your grandmother or your great-grandmother or a great-great-grandmother did, you may inherit the same kind of genetic memory that the woman who experienced the event has. You have the same symptoms that she has. So I'm just going to briefly go through this. This is most of the history that most of you know already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But I give this presentation to other audiences, and I can tell you that this is not taught. This is an area of huge ignorance in the general public about the way that the indigenous people were treated. These are some of the things of value that we all hold as part of defining who we are. And I left some blanks because you might have areas that you fill in yourself. And everything was destroyed. So the first one is genocide. Prior to European contact, it was estimated that there were right around 140 million indigenous people living in the North and South American continents. And conservative estimates are that 100 million died. There was the deliberate infection, slavery, loss of habitat, introduction of alcohol, massacres, and forced removals. And so the next awful thing that happened was boarding schools. Since 1813, there have been 141 Native American boarding schools. And the idea of the boarding school was what? Yeah, the say, kill the Indian, save the man. The idea was to erase every vestige of culture that that child may have. And what's worse are the many, many documented cases of abuse that went on in the boarding schools. The Indian Relocation Act of 1956 was another plan to get the Indians off the reservation and assimilated into mainstream America. And you may have relatives or know of people who, because of this program, were left the reservation and never really came back. Lost that part of their heritage, lost that connection. This last figure is very important. 64% higher urban Indian population than in 1943 because of this. And as women, because women are sacred, this is the one that's the hardest. And I'll tell you that a couple of years ago I was giving this similar presentation to at the Utah Domestic Violence Council Coalition conference, and a woman in the audience called me a liar for presenting this information. We gave this presentation a couple of weeks ago, and this year no one called me a liar, so I guess I'm making some kind of progress. How many of you knew about this? Now, see, not all of you even knew about this. And again, look at that last bullet point. The birth rate was cut in half, essentially. And something I didn't put in there, but I could have, is that full breed women, full Indian women, were the ones who were targeted, the ones who had the most native blood. And so we had these periods of the historical trauma, the removal period. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. Yeah.
I have a comment to make.
One of the things that is important to remember is that these children were taken. It wasn't something they signed up for. Exactly. And you know, we have boarding schools now, but the premise of the boarding school that we have now is considerably different. One of the schools that we work with is the Richfield Residential Hall, where it's mostly Navajo students who are there, and they go during the school year, and then they go home to the reservation in the summer. These children were taken sometimes when they were 5, 6 years old, and they didn't go back home until they were 18. Their entire childhood years were spent away from home, from family, from community, from culture. And a secondary impact of that is, what did they learn about being parents there? How were they taught how to behave? By being beaten. So when you look at instances of child abuse within the tribal populations, where did they learn that? Coming from a culture where children were the sacred spirits. So the impact of the boarding schools linger today. But here's the good news. All of these efforts to erase Native Americans from their land, it didn't work. And the secret is resiliency. The tribes have demonstrated resiliency far above anything that we could possibly imagine, considering what they've gone through. And I love this quote: "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." And so now we've kind of reached in the Native journey, the self-determination period, with increased awareness of tribal sovereignty and increased Native American activism. Another quote demonstrating resiliency. It is a spiritual force deeply embedded in our people. This resiliency, this magnificent resiliency. So back to epigenetics and why the little history lesson. To reinforce that idea that as a people, the tribes have experienced horrible trauma. And that trauma has resonated into generations. And what I want to emphasize too is that this doesn't happen to everybody. It's not, if this happened to your great-grandmother, it's going to happen to you. It's not that simple. Don't overgeneralize when you're talking about this. Some people, the gene kicks in, becomes active. Other people, it just doesn't. Epigenetics is still controversial because it crosses that nature-nurture divide. And it shows that DNA can be altered in a single generation rather than many generations. And the traumatized parent, in this case the mother, can pass the altered gene on to her children, even though she did not experience or inherit it herself. So a quick review of epigenetics. So if diet and chemicals can cause epigenetic changes, could certain experiences like child abuse, child neglect, drug abuse, historic trauma also set off epigenetic changes to the DNA? And epigenetics says yes, it can. Elders in the tribes have long recognized the intergenerational effects of historical trauma. Do we have any, I know we have Irene here, do we have any other elders in the audience? Francine? Okay. I'd just kind of like to open this up and have you give a comment or two, if you wouldn't mind. Yeah, I have a question.
On your last slide, on the epigenetics, you're saying historical trauma, but then you're saying epigenetic changes in DNA can, just like if your grandparents have a gene and your parents don't get it, but you can get it.
Exactly.
Who pulled up that research? Who did the studies on that?
I've got the sources at the end of the presentation, and all of this came about because some generations who have experienced the Holocaust, the grandchildren of those.
So the same people that did that study did one on the Jewish Holocaust, and then they did one on the Native American.
Right. Yep.
And actually proved that there was a...
It's not proven.
It's not proven?
It's not proven. It's just that there are very, very strong markers that indicate that this is happening.
It's a theory?
It's a theory at this point. But so is relativity. But we all know that relativity is true. So, do we have any elder who would like to speak to this?
Just about everybody knows me. I'm Angie Chickup, and I'm one of the young seniors here. But on this topic that she's explaining, my eldest granddaughter, China, she was explaining this to me about 2 weeks ago in regards, we were talking about my grandkids, and she explained this whole thing to me. And I kind of understand that because sometimes I question, I question about my health, I question about my mental abilities, and then I pray a lot. And my prayers are answered my questions are answered regarding my ancestries. And a lot of our behaviors does go back to a few generations. And I believe this because I've experienced it, because I have questioned, I've gone through a period of, I've had 2 marriages, and then somehow both of them had an alcoholic problem. And there were times that they did come, they would threaten, and I just didn't like the feeling that I was going through. So I would prepare myself. I knew that when they'd go out, they were going to come home drunk. So I would prepare myself not to even be at the house, It was a preparation. And later on through the years, I kind of thought, why do I do this, Why am I already preparing myself to get out of these situations? So I go back and think of my great-great-grandparents, because they must have gone through some kind of trauma, and therefore that I learned how to prepare myself, and I learned how to live. But I was raised by my great-grandparents, Willie and Gladys Chigup, and my grandmother always talked to me about our traditional ways, and that's how I teach my daughters today. And I've always let them know who their relatives were when they're very young, so that they won't go off and marry their relatives. And I let them know, please do not, it didn't happen. I wanted them to marry someone that was childless, because their problems are going to come to them. It's going to interfere with their lives. But, children don't listen. They have to experience their lives. But this is true. You might want to pray about it. You might think about it. What kind of life did my grandparents have, or my great-grandparents, or great-great, And it is a true fact that today that we carry some of these, their past lives within us. And if you're very spiritual, if you're prayerful, pray and ask for those answers, because it will come to you. And some of us are born with special way of life. Some of us are healers, and some of us know the futures. And you're blessed with that. And you probably don't even know that you're carrying it within you. But you do. Maybe you're lost. Maybe you didn't get guidance from your grandparents. But we all have it in us. We're natives. So if you've got questions, ask someone about your family. But I direct you guys to get spiritual. Pray, ask for answers, and it's there. And you don't know that you got protectors next to you, walking along with you every day where you go. Maybe all of a sudden something tells you, hey, don't do that, or don't go there. Do you listen to it? Then there's consequences. Maybe something tells you not to go to a certain place or drive somewhere. Maybe your keys get lost sometimes, and then there it is, an hour later or next day. That has all to do with your tradition. So listen to it. Don't avoid it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, so what we're seeing as folks who are working with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, we are seeing the victims come to us and they're presenting symptoms of PTSD. but they have never gone through an experience that would have explained why they're exhibiting PTSD, except for the idea of genetic inheritance. So these are just some of the DSM. Okay, so how many of you in the audience know someone who has a drug problem, has an alcohol problem, have experienced suicide? Keep your hands up. Have experienced suicide in your family? Your children have a history of truancy? You are very familiar with violence? These are some of the acting out that PTSD survivors experience. And here's how it's playing in the Native communities. I think this first statistic is horribly wrong. I think it's far higher. Based on conversations I've had with people in the tribal communities, I was talking to many young women. I've been talking to many young women, and to them, sexual assault is not something they hope to avoid. It's something they know is going to happen. It's not an if question for them, it's a when question. So we talked a little bit about the impact of the boarding schools and the way the children were disciplined. And we see this presenting itself as an extraordinarily high number of child abuse cases in tribal communities. Parents did not learn how to be parents. One of the areas that I focus in on, because I'm a former classroom teacher, is what's happening with the tribal children in the schools. How many of you know someone who's had a very promising child who all of a sudden just checked out of the educational system? The University of Utah did a study about 2 years ago now, and it was called the Classroom to Prison Pipeline. And it demonstrated a clear relationship between the amount of tribal children who are in the schools and the types of discipline. And what this demonstrated clearly is the tribal children were receiving far more severe discipline than non-tribal children. Particularly with the white community, the children were given chances, and it was maybe an escalating situation where first infraction, not a lot happened. Second infraction, a little bit more. Third infraction, consequences started to get more severe. Fourth, fifth, sixth, and on, until finally they were turned over to the juvenile justice system. Well, that didn't happen with the Native children. It was kind of like 1, maybe 2 times, and then you're out. And I can tell you that, unhappily, the Uinta Basin was one of the areas that had one of the highest disproportionate number of Native American children who were not treated fairly in the school system. And here are some more facts, the way that the PTSD is playing out. We've talked a little bit about alcohol. We talked about drugs. And then there are co-occurring disorders. Like you might have the alcohol problem, which leads to suicide. Suicide rates among Native Americans are 3.2 times higher than the national average. Look at that statistic. For males between 15 and 19, 32.7 per 100,000. Double more than double the next racial demographic. And the last bullet, it's been found that the increase in the number of suicides corresponds to a lack of linkage between the adolescents and their cultural path and their ability to relate to their past to their current situation in the future. PTSD, historical trauma. So now we have a relationship between PTSD and the psychological functioning. This has been documented. So it's very logical to say that many of the things that the Native Americans have experienced and are experiencing are based on his inherited PTSD because of the historic trauma that their ancestors experienced. So how many of you have heard people say, well, why don't they just get over it? You've heard that? Why don't they just get over it? That happened a long time ago. Gee, what's their problem? Just get over it. I was at a legislative Indian caucus day a few years back, and our present governor was talking to a Navajo elder, and he was making some comments. The elder was making comments about the school system down in the Four Corners area, and the governor said to him, well, you look like you've assimilated pretty well. Your English is really good. When I'm sitting there going, don't you realize you have just insulted every single Native American in this room? Yeah. Telling someone, yeah, you've lost your culture. Yep, you're doing a good job. Yep. So go back to this question of, even though you did not experience it yourself, you may have inherited it from your grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother. And even though it didn't occur in your living history, or even the living history of your parents, you can still inherit this genetic marker that causes you to present symptoms of PTSD as though you had experienced the event yourself. A very good study was called the Historical Loss Scale, and this was really interesting results. The participants had been removed by generations from the historic trauma, but they were still having these kinds of thoughts. Thoughts about the loss of language and community. Thoughts about the loss of culture. Feeling angry. They're disturbing thoughts. And the last two are something that, as advocates working in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, this has really strong implications for us. We need to understand, as white people, that a lot of times we're not going to be trusted simply because we are white. And there's a really good, justifiable reason for that. So, I like to use this little story, that something that happened with me. And our coalition was traveling to Devil Lake, North Dakota to meet with a sister coalition up there. Plane connections got all messed up, and I wound up missing a flight out of Denver and didn't get up to Devil's Lake until after 10 o'clock at night. And Devil's Lake is just, it's a small community. And when I was the last person on the plane. Everybody else got off, but I was the last person on the plane. And I got there and the airport was closed. completely closed. Nobody there. There was a phone. And the woman who was supposed to pick me up didn't come to pick me up. I'm in Devil's Lake. It's after 10 o'clock. It's dark. It's cold. It's April. It's not, turned out to be a beautiful community, but I couldn't see it then. So what was my first thought? I was getting ready to call 911. I was going to call a police officer to come and get me and take me to my hotel. How many of you would have done that? You would have? You would have? Good. We have one person in the room who would have done it besides me. And why would I do that? For safety? Because I trust police officers. My history has never given me a reason not to trust police officers. I grew up being told, if you get in trouble, call the police. How many of you are teaching your children, when you get in trouble, call the police? Why? Yeah. Yeah. So the way that the way that as a white person might think, I might not get it if I have a victim come to me and I would say to her, well, did you call the police? Did you get a protective order? No. Why not? Well, maybe it's because for a long time you have not had good history with the police and with the courts. For a long, long time. And I'm saying this with these three officers right here. And thank you for coming. And it's especially good to see men here because men are the other part of the answer. We cannot do this without the men's support. So just be aware of that. And maybe be aware of what your children are seeing as you try to reconcile the past with the present and the future. Be aware of what your children are seeing. And like I said, if you want this PowerPoint, I'll be happy to send it to you. And I'm not reading everything because what I'm wanting is to just present an overview so that you can fill in the blanks according to your own experience and your own interpretations.
I just don't like to speak all the time because, I'd rather listen and have others speak. But I can't help but to make a comment about when she's talking about the traumas, especially the historical traumas. I'm an elder. I'm proud to say I am an elder. 78 years old. I will be 79 this coming January. And, but I went to the boarding school when she was talking about boarding school. Couldn't help but think my life back then at the boarding school. I went to boarding school at age, I believe it was 6, 7 years old. I didn't know the English language, just spoke Ute. And my mother didn't go to school at all. So she only spoke Ute. And my dad, yes, he went to school. I believe he went for his 8th or 9th or 10th. I don't know exactly what grade, the high school he went to. He went to Sherman, Riverside, California. And when he came back, my mom and dad were married in a traditional way. her parents and his parents. They're the ones that united them. They didn't know each other. But anyway, knowing just youth, it was kind of difficult. We had to learn English fast. And there were a lot of kids up there, some of them. In fact, I was very scared because I didn't know any of the kids when I got there. We were all little. There were some bigger, older kids. Of course, I had my sisters that had gone there before. So I just stuck with them. I just hung on to my sister's skirt because I was afraid to take off or go somewhere, you know, because I didn't know the other kids. But anyway, I saw it. The boarding school, it was strict, very strict. Every place we went, we had to go in line. Whether it was to our meals, to school, or wherever, we had to follow. And there was always someone there, a teacher or matron or whoever there, made sure we stayed in line. And you know, we were prohibited to speak Ute. We couldn't speak Ute. And if you did, if you got caught, got punished. I think this is where we lost our language. Now, barely few of us speak it. And you know, I myself, because I don't have any elders around to speak it with, I'm starting to lose some of the guttural effects, how to say it. But I still remember most of my language. But you know, I tried not to get in trouble. We had to get we had to learn our ABCs fast. You know, I caught on because I didn't want to get in trouble. But kids that didn't learn, got punished. They were told to stand in a corner. So I saw that, but I didn't, because I made up my mind I'm going to learn. And maybe that's, and I think when you hear about bullies, you know, you hear about bullying now, I saw that up there. Of course, I'm little. I was always little. And we got bullied by older girls, bigger girls. They told us to go get this and that, ordered us around, picked on us. So I saw that. Got my hair pulled, and I was afraid of them. Finally, I thought to myself, I'm going to stand up to them. I might be little. And I did. They pushed me, and I got mad. I just charged into that one girl. She was always picking on me. But anyway, I was surprised. I made her cry. And I took off looking for my older sister, because she said she was going to go tell her sister. And I took off. But you know, after that, she never picked on me anymore. I said, I'm going to stand up for myself, and, you know, I'm not going to put up with any more of this. And I said, I'm going to learn. And I did, you know. I even learned fast, and I was even able to teach class. I taught my 6th grade class, because I was able to learn fast. And you know, once in a while, I think when I speak, people can say, you kind of got an accent. I think that might be the boarding school accent. Trying to learn English. But anyway, I'm proud. I'm glad I didn't give in. I didn't give in to any of the bullying that went on up there. But I might have gotten in trouble, but if I spoke back. But anyway, it's been a life experience. But I'm glad my mom told me, go to school, don't be like me. I never went to school. You are going to learn the white man's language. And go to school, that's going to help you, she said, to keep going. So it's my mom's encouraging words that made me keep going. So, but I can see the trauma, maybe with others, what it caused. A lot of them lost their values, maybe from, but I remember back then, a lot of our families were farmers. They had gardens. You didn't see much of, I guess you could say, waste, even with hunting. They would hunt it, dry deer meat, everything. Now it's different. When you look at the pictures, I don't want to read this up, but you know, around their homes, you didn't see much clutter, trash. It's always clean. But it's changed people now. People, to me, you know, I don't know what the word is, don't care anymore or what. But we got to start caring, start taking care of our families, our homes, our land, and not give up. And I think when people don't care, that's when all this violence come about. Don't care, alcohol, whatever, but I've seen a lot. And I hope to be around a few more years. You know, but I've learned all that. I experienced it, I witnessed it living in a boarding school was closed down back in 1950 in White Rocks. You don't see anything of it anymore, no buildings, nothing. But it was a beautiful campus, it was a nice campus. But that was my second home. But was there for 9 months out of the year. But it was hard to come home for 3 months and then go back to school again. The bus came around, picked us up and transported us back to school. So that was it. But it was kind of hard, but survived it. The way. Thank you.
Thank you, and I hope I can call you Irene. It turns out that's my mother's. That's the traditional middle name on my mother's side of the family. My great-grandmother was Catherine Irene, my grandmother was Nellie Irene, and my mother is Lynette Irene, and my sister is Melanie Irene. So it's a great name. I want to thank Irene for making those comments because it emphasizes something that we need to be aware of, and that's not to overgeneralize. Sometimes the boarding experience was a good experience. And particularly after the turn of the century, they started to become a little more humane. But those early years, in the 1850s until about the 1820s, they were brutal. There are stories that are coming out now about boarding schools in Canada where during the First World War, when the schools were running out of food, they were actually killing the children because they couldn't feed them all. So just a reminder that conventional advocacy needs to be adjusted to be culturally appropriate. And any advocate working with a Native American victim should have at least a basic understanding of the dynamics of historical trauma. So while we may see what appears to be an irrational fear of institutions, of law enforcement, of advocates, it's actually a manifestation of that epigenetic PTSD. And that sense of hopelessness and that feeling that nothing can change, another epigenetic manifestation of PTSD. I don't know why this isn't coming up on the screen, but I have oh there it is, there's the medicine wheel. One of the things that Tina Groves is going to talk about this afternoon is how to incorporate the medicine wheel when you're working with a Native American victim. This is just one of the many examples of a medicine wheel, and her presentation is it's just incredible. You're really going to like it. We're done. Thank you very much.